Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, July 14th, 2020. Recently, I've been teaching a small group on God and racial justice. And in this small group, we've been considering the words and ideas of many different thinkers, but two jumped out to me, and I think they actually speak to where we are in compelling ways. The first is Emilie Townes, a womanist theologian at Vanderbilt University, who in one of her early books talks about what she describes as systemic and structural evil, which she says is not only linked to the structural realities in our society like poverty and racism, but it's also connected, she suggests, to this idea of a hegemonic imagination. Namely, our theological ways of making sense of the world are constrained and narrowed in self-protective ways. They reflect the sorts of power structures that push us forward rather than being imaginative disruptions of those power structures in the name of justice, the excluded, and the marginalized. Similarly, the words of Howard Thurman. For Thurman, imagination is the ability to see oneself from the outside. It's what allows us to take on different perspectives such that we can recognize what it is like to be us as seen by the eyes of another. Now, this idea by Emilie Townes and Howard Thurman of imagination being, we might say, a kind of ecstasy, an ecstasis, a standing outside of yourself to rupture what you would take for granted about the world. I think it's important to draw on these ideas, not simply in order to rethink how we engage about questions of race and gender and sexuality and class, but also how we even right now think about public policy in light of the pandemic. We are all trying to find ways forward to return to normal, as we hear a lot. And yet we see people pushing to be back in person in school, for example, regardless of the realities of public health. We see bosses pushing their employees to come back to work because we can't think of any other way to return to some sort of social life. This is a failure of imagination. It's a failure of our national leadership, our local leadership, even all of us who are simply leaders in our spheres of influence. How can we start to rethink the fundamental structures by which we engage in business, by which we engage in educational opportunities, and by which we engage in democratic life? We've got to think more constructively, but we've also got to think more imaginatively. We can't simply hegemonically reinforce the power structure of a particular model of economic interaction as somehow a necessity for human existence. Human existence can be understood otherwise, and in the midst of a crisis like this, it must be. So, may we draw on the words of Emilie Townes, thinking about the way evil is linked to our collective failure of imagination. May we draw on Howard Thurman, encouraging us to see ourselves from the perspective of another. And then may we use those voices to come together and think about what we can do to transform our world in light of this pandemic, rather than simply trying to find ways for the pandemic not to be something interrupting the world that we think is necessary. I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.